All right. I would like to welcome back everybody. It's been quite a long day for all of us, and we're just thinking to shorten a bit the roundtable discussion. So instead of an hour, we make it half an hour to 3/4 of an hour, according to how the discussion goes and the engagement of the public. Would like to open it directly to our guests, but also the audience should feel free either to pursue a discussion from the previous 3 sessions or try to work between the 3 sessions. So either to continue a discussion that has already happened or to get in a thinking and discussion on the generality of the day. Thank you. Does anybody have a question or want to pick a particular issue, or shall we? We can start by asking the panel, their thoughts of the day in terms of not particular and specific criticism on individual papers and presentations, but much more in terms of how they see the relevance of this in their own work and in the field today.
General state of current thinking, and it's reflected in the debates we had here during the day, but it seems to be also typical for many schools around the world. There seems to be going to kind of wave where people sort of believe that the digital world itself, and I mean the digital world in a kind of tangible sense, which means computers, the software that goes with it, and so on, is some kind of a magic box that if you look at it long enough, interesting answer may come out of it. What I think is forgotten about is that whatever you think of architecture, doesn't matter in what time, today or future, it's about what and how. We seem to be really focusing almost exclusively on how, believing that with the how, at some point, the what would emerge. That simply the world of digital is some kind of a hidden dimension of creativity. The prosaic truth, if you talk to people who really know about it more than we do, they just smile at you and say very quickly, you have to make a distinction between productive and creative abilities and possibilities. The machine is extremely efficient in production. Once it knows what to do, we cannot cope with the speed. And also the change is coming from that, because the speed generates another increase in speed, and so on, so it goes. There is one thing which is somewhere in the reciprocity of what and how. People who are doing currently more kind of interesting future development in the digital world, they're talking about artificial intelligence usually, it's sort of AI. And what is interesting about that is that there's no problem in getting faster, becoming faster in terms of collection, data, information, so-called. Call it whatever you like, data or information. One thing which is definitely not happening, and to the frustration of all the people at the top, and I'm thinking of Stanford, MIT, Edinburgh, Cambridge, places like that. The vehicle is not somehow there. In the most recent research paper from a long journey in Stanford, they try to put together as complete as possible body of information about surrounding world, which has to do with preparation for robotics, kind of robot that can really move around. Optical information, acoustic information, tactile, kinetic, you can go on and on. They move around the circle, and the vehicle was one of the tricky things to find out. How you bring it together, what holds it together. In a funny way, it comes on a surface, just back to the Corbusier question, what on earth you do with all this information, how you bring it together. Fine, put it aside, that's a comment. What they come as a conclusion, and they say, well, we have to now, for the time being, acknowledge that the best structure that we have as a vehicle to hold it together is the structure of our world as we already have it. The world that we're living in is a latent world. It's not just world of concepts and so on. The structure of it, the richness, the complexity is absolutely outstanding. And that's really what I've been myself involved in recent, several years. What's happening at the moment for instance, in Cambridge is that the people who are doing digital world and developing photo possibilities, bio possibilities for computers, the next stage, they're starting from both ends. They're looking at the possibility of the processing, but even more on the other side, the structure of the brain, the structure of the mind, how the mind operates, the reciprocity of the machine, and human abilities. It's to be taken into consideration. What I find still slightly frustrating about the commitment to digital in, as I said, first sentence in school, is the somehow one-dimensionality of the approach. There's not much talk about current brain research, neurophysiology, fantastic territories, anthropology, psychiatry, psychology. You can put it all together, there's no end to it. But that whole body basically nowadays comes into what they call neurophysiological research. There are some stunning results, and it's no doubt that when we're talking about the need for some kind of a vehicle, integration is there. If you take it strictly to our territory, architecture, the machine doesn't have a clue about space. It can be informed, it can be ordered, it can be that could be input in, but we do have a very profound fundamental dimension. Somebody said today in the talk, computers can do more than we. Well, I would say fine. In what sense? Unless you answered that question, you said nothing. They can do more in terms of complexity, in terms of speed, and so on and so forth. But we cannot possibly, if you go deeper into it, ignore the fundamental difference between complexity and richness. Because the richness, you can be complex, beyond a certain point, you're moving into chaos, and you're losing the game. What saves the game is the richness, in reciprocity with certain kind of order. That's how it crystallizes into something which really makes sense. So my plea, for anybody who is really devoted to that sort of line of thought, don't forget that the spectrum has two ends. We cannot simply get the answer just following it from one end. The machine tells you what you ask for, and the question depends on the other side of the spectrum. Simple conclusion on that score. And that opens obviously a number of issues that we may talk about. But I'm slightly always sort of surprised, to say the least, surprised how many intelligent people, and in this school, there are whole departments of intelligent people, or at least 1.5. And I wonder, why they don't see that. It seems to be very, very obvious. If you look a little bit broader context, and places where they do it, this kind of studies, it's like architects occasionally think that they're as good as engineers. Well, they're not, because they have a different training and different background. You can't be everything under the sun. So just listen what they're doing. And each time I talk to my brother who is into polymers and stuff like that, and physicists, and I tell him what architects are doing, and he looked at me sort of silently and said, "Are they serious? Are they serious?" Because there is a kind of dialogue even in the most abstract field. You're surrounded by the most powerful machines, and you're still walking around the lab with little notebook and pencil and check. There's a kind of dialogue which is absolutely crucial. It has to do, in our case, of course, with the dialogue between the conceptual and visual culture. Because the kind of thing I'm talking about, the neurophysiologists, they deal with things like perception, the deep structures of experience, structure of spatiality and space, simultaneity of experiences, synesthesias, you name it. But then basically structuring of the primary territory on which we as architects operate. So, future. Certain dimensions that we should not ignore. I'm talking too much.
I feel I just want to kind of put a footnote to what Dalibor said, because I don't think it would be particularly kind of useful this afternoon if it gets into a sort of pro or contra the computer or indeed the digital. I mean, it seems to me that what I would want to say in response to Dalibor is that in some sense he makes the digital, or that part of it which he feels that he can support, it's kind of reducible essentially to what you might call is-prosthetic kind of capacities. So yes, it was said earlier that it can do things quicker, faster, whatever. Now, if that were all, it seems to me there wouldn't be an argument. If the computer, but I'll come back to the very use of the term in a moment, were just a kind of set of prosthetic aids, then it would have an important social and economic consequence, but really not many at the level of thought. But it seems to me that if we consider it also as not the technology, but as part of a technology, then we have to admit that technologies are involved in fundamental kind of cultural changes. Changes indeed in how people do think. I think it's, this is one of the reasons why I'd be very cautious about introducing the notion here of creativity, because I'm sure that technologies change the way people think, and to take, so that we can get out of some contention about the computer, what could have been more influential than the introduction of the technology of writing? Anthropologists would make that the introduction of that technology probably the most fundamental technological change in the history of human cultures. So that even now, to some extent, anthropology divides itself into pre- and post-literate societies. We could not, creative scholarship would probably argue that something like the domain of philosophy could not have started without the technology of writing. I think the jury's still out on the question of the introduction of printing. It seems to me that much, which actually comes within the scope of architectural drawing, is an effect of printing, and the way in which certain specialized forms of representation, whether they're done by the hand or whether they're done by the printing press, are an effect of that revolution. So it seems to me, again, we shouldn't get trapped into thinking almost that there's a natural form of architectural representation, the plan, the section, whatever, and then something digital, because, as it were, they're both an effect of different kind of technologies. I suppose I'm also a bit surprised in a way, that the more usual kind of I don't know about hostility to technology, is that it takes a sort of pessimistic view, in a kind of Heideggerian form, that it is part and parcel of a kind of instrumentalized form of social reasoning and calculation, and to some extent we haven't actually kind of discussed that aspect. But, I mean, to me, it seems to me, certainly what was said here today, really contained no extravagant commitment either way on the question of the digital. It seemed to me that it was relatively neutral.
I'll just make a footnote to the footnote and then invite my colleagues to keep adding the footnotes on, and then it'll be thoroughly scholarly by virtue of the sheer density of footnotes, but also by virtue of nothing actually ever having been said. So I'd like to contribute at that level. Actually, to sort of disagree a little bit with Mark, but to sort of agree with the final point, but express some concern that the positioning of the digital as merely prosthetic, as distinct from something else, runs the risk as well. And I think that it would be, let's say, sort of a general comment. I think that I think the papers were really fantastic, and it was really a great pleasure to listen to them. But I think one of the questions that was asked, I think in the last panel, that there needed to be a sort of bit clearer definition of technology. That seems to be absolutely crucial. So first of all, the technology needed to be defined, at least in a preliminary way, in order that there could be some sort of fight. And actually, I think the lack of heat in the discussions after each panel came from that fact, that if anybody had tightened up their definition of technology, there would have been warfare, because a number of different definitions would have come into play. And as a result, there was this sort of, just sort of cautious discussion. What would follow from a sharper definition of technology, and the easiest way to frame that is that each of the speakers, including myself now, could be forced to sort of point to something that's not technology and explain their decision as to what that technology is. And then following from that, one would then probably more easily be able to sort of get some grasp of this word digital, which is again just a word that floats in and floats out with a rough sense that we know what we're talking about. But if, for example, what we want to do or find ourselves doing is sort of dismissing the current use of or current fetishization of the digital, and if that's even the very premise of this conference, if I read the text correctly, we would then likely be using the word in the way that the people we are criticizing use it. In other words, for us to dismiss their claims about the digital, we have to accept their definitions of the digital. So rather than say, we don't think you're doing anything new, we would say, actually, we don't think what you're doing is digital, actually. And it seems to me that's a very crucial point to make. If you want to say that somebody's not interesting, and it seems to me that's 99% of the time what we want to say in every situation, not just academic conferences, you want to in some way identify where interest lies, then the use of the word seems very important. On this question of the brain, I completely agree, so much so that we're in the middle of a kind of three-part series of conferences on the brain, which unite artists and architects and neurobiologists and so on. I think it is an absolutely crucial issue. But it's actually there where my point of potential disagreement with Mark comes, because again, depending on one's definition of technology, one might be thinking of the brain as a technology. And in that sense, it would not be the possible relationships between thought and the computer could be quite complex. They would not simply be. It would not simply be the relationship between even the what and the how in Delavor's terms, nor would it necessarily allow an easy distinction between productive and creative. In fact, the most interesting, some of what I find the most interesting in contemporary brain research is where the kind of biological account of the brain is in some synergy now with the electrical account of the brain, which is also working quite well with psychiatry, psychology, neurobiology, cognitive science, and so on. There really have been some new cross-disciplinary associations, many of them triggered at the level of biology. So interestingly, biology is sort of surfacing as a sort of a meta term. And once you hit the biological, by whichever you mean, I would be reluctant to separate the digital from the biological, or at least I'd want to spend some time on that. So these are just sort of cautious notes. But it gets back to the speakers of today, who again I think were very, very good. But if one wanted each of the papers to be a kind of a weapon, some of those definitions would need to be sharpened up so that they could then do their work. To take one example, the idea that the design of a building and the construction of a building can now follow directly from, or more or less directly from, what used to be considered a secondary and suspect form of seduction. So let's say working drawings at one end and with no colour, no light, just line, instructions for construction at one end, and soft Californian light bathing a project which is somehow glowing and slightly focusing, and everybody in the rendering being from the ages of 18 to 25, the kind of perfect, happy consumer age, an image which indicates that the building promises the absence of trauma, which is the way those words, that one could, from such an image, generate the building. I would not want to immediately think that that would constitute a kind of evacuation of the deep, even spiritual core, and certainly not intellectual core of our field. It could well be that in understanding that sort of reverse translation, we would think much more clearly and much more precisely, and it may well be that we have never fully understood any construction drawings, and it may well be that even those of us who consider ourselves expert in the production of buildings are in the end utterly astonished by the fact that a building appears as a fact. And if that's the case, if in the end all of our knowledge, all of our specialized knowledge has just left us mystified by our own accomplishments, then it might be an interesting lesson to, as it were, force ourselves to go with the mystified end. And I think that certainly in the hands of the best students, on the assumption that they're more intelligent than us, or indicate where new intelligence lies, some students seem to be able to work from the position of an absence of knowledge, as was pointed out before, to new forms of knowledge that may ultimately become, and it seems to me if 99% of students make images that look like buildings but actually stumble when in the production of a building, that doesn't bother me as long as 1 out of the 100 students makes that move and teaches the rest of us something. And I think that's a possible field. Without seduction, I'm not sure that we are able to think. And it, of course, thought is the most seductive thing. Architects, by the way, don't get paid, as a rule. So actually, for us, thinking is powerfully, powerfully seductive. It's all as if we would never get to realize any of our dreams, right? I think. Anyway, it's a speech.
Somebody said, for that, the tendency, when it reaches a certain point, it becomes absurd. When you say, well, I've got the answer. What was the question?
Yeah.
Right? So it's a bit like kind of upside down world. I would just one little comment, if it helps at all. I'm not going to do definition, but it may help for any kind of further bit of discussion. Technology is productive knowledge, basically. It's not machines, instruments in the kind of traditional old sense, wires and stuff, hardware. It's a productive knowledge. And productive knowledge, in direct sense, is, well, you can go with a way of making, techne, and theoretical way of making, which is very important. Techne theoretic, I would put it into that. So which means theoretical way of making. What does it mean is that, forget about the theoretical, we can put universal. That's really one of the fundamental difference from territories on which we operate, cities, architecture, design, and so on. Technology is technology when it becomes universal. And we know it very well from the funny terms using again transfer of technology. That's why we can very easily send it to China or send it to Africa, whatever. In no time they can do the same thing as we're doing here. You can't do it with sculptures. Try to teach yourself Zulu or one of those languages. It will take a few years. So you can't do it. And the fundamental difference, therefore, is that between architecture and technological approach. Technology obviously is part of architecture, but as it were, it's in a kind of reverse sense. You have to situate technology in order to make an architecture out of it. And you can see it in engineering structure. In the last minute, the engineer still has to have a kind of dimension of imagination, which is architectural, broadly speaking, or consulting with architect, and puts the piece on site. The context is something which the engineering training or strictly technological training doesn't provide. And we know it very well because we got in our department next door engineers, and we share occasionally. We invite them for a course. And they suddenly tell you the truth. In fact, when you start working on a project, fine. very briefly, half sentence, that the difference between the strictly technological approach, say engineering and architecture in our territory, is that the engineer really cares about it to the extent that it has its universal qualities. If it doesn't have universal qualities, the bridge cannot be transferred and built by somebody else, a different team of people and so on. It's not really a decent project. So, in that sense, architecture is kind of application. What the engineer do with the universal knowledge when it comes to concrete tasks, particular bridge, particular structure, particular hall or whatever, he's doing it by application. And somebody used the term today, vis-a-vis architecture, where I would stop. For engineering, yes, experiment. By experiment, you can do it. It works or it doesn't work. And of course, engineers will do a lot of experiments before it goes on site in laboratories. They can measure it, they can break the structures and whatever they have. Architects cannot afford to do it by experiment. They should have a direct knowledge, because otherwise it doesn't come to experiment, it comes to a disaster. And we have seen in the 20th century enough of those disasters. It sounds terribly bestial, but if people don't understand that new towns, the satellites of Paris, the whole territory of Europe surrounded by quote-unquote urban developments, half of them are straightforward disaster. If you don't see that, we are blind. The irony is, of course, that a great deal of the new development is still following the same pattern, except the specifications are better materials, but the primary principles have not changed. Because, strangely enough, or not strangely enough, for the developers, this particular thinking is incredibly convenient. They are at home there. And the big commercial offices, SOM and so on, there are dozens and dozens of those offices, they are very happy because they're just simply making money. So this particular universality of approach leads to, in one sense, to experiment. You can experiment with a number of things, but in architecture you can't. You shouldn't. That's the ethos of architecture as a field. And there is a room for ethics, which again, digital world tells you very little about, because it doesn't care about, good or bad. It's only how. Only with the what you open the door to the question, is it good solution or bad solution? In terms of ethos, in terms of, what we may call kind of the social context, cultural context, etc., etc., etc. I feel very passionate about that.
Do you mind if I respond for a second? I mean, I'm trying to sort of ascribe to what you're thinking, but at the same time try to actually understand what you mean by what you're saying. I think at some moment that architecture... No, I mean, it's clear in one sense, but then I think somehow there's certain assumptions on this. I mean, there's an assumption that you choose to be with technology or against technology, but architectural by its very nature, I think, is technological. I think also there's this idea that you mentioned that architecture, and this is, I think, where we need to actually clarify the definitions of what you mean, should not be experimental. But I would argue that architecture should be much more experimental. Because in one sense, what we do offer that's very different from the discussions of engineers and so forth is we try to construct alternative realities, partly somewhere caught between the realities of the existing world that you are talking about, but not necessarily the developer-driven world. I mean, for example, you mentioned the whole notion of the science, neurophysiology, and so forth. That was always part of the underlying understanding of computation for the last 50 or 60 years. There were research labs that were actually trying to explore computation and its relationships. In IIT, there was a biological computation lab. In other forms of practice, those things had a very direct engagement, and architecture played a fundamental role in it, but for reasons that we wouldn't actually call architectural. When I mentioned the architecture machine group, Negroponte, and the reason he got much of the funding from the AI department at MIT was because he was getting results that they couldn't, because they didn't adopt a sort of scientific method. They adopted something that was much more conducive to a form of play.
But just to interrupt you, you're speaking very eloquently, but it's fallen into exactly the trap that Mark may have set that up. Like if somebody says, don't touch that chocolate, it just by saying let's not have a discussion about which is sort of either for or against the digital. So you're on the defensive for the digital because you were on the attack. And it seems to me you shouldn't be put into that situation because
I'm not.
The digital is as it were awaiting scholarly analysis, which is, let's say, what's happening at this conference. Whereas you are in a certain way short-circuiting the analysis by saying it's sort of Wild West ethically, and as such you're greatly concerned about it. And I think therefore those of you who work more on the digital feel like you have to say, well, I got principles too.
No, Mark, I think that the issue was, you talked about something about seduction and the mystical nature.
Yeah.
And I think somehow we treat the digital as it's some kind of novel thing, but the digital is actually not quite novel at all. The digital is very much part of our everyday, and if we sort of treat it as something other, then it always remains as something other. And the truth is, then we actually do always sort of construct this kind of black and white discussion, where actually the really interesting thing is, you mentioned that there wasn't any fireworks in the panel discussion, and I think there could have been, but I think that would sort of undermine really what a larger project is at hand, which is that the fact is we are at a moment where we can communicate to different disciplines in a very provocative and straightforward way. You go to conferences, for example, like was just that one at UPenn, which they tried to discuss nonlinear fabrication, and you have cell biologists that are really looking towards architects because of their ability, because you mentioned cell biology, their ability to visualize, to offer something that scientific method have not. So there's afforded opportunity, I think, for architects to actually redefine what architecture actually means for them. I think then you actually get to the point where we actually have personal accountability for the terms that we actually engage with. And then I really think we're doing something, because otherwise, outside I keep looking at this pavilion that we were part of doing. There's nothing revolutionary, there's nothing digital about it. It's concrete, it's bolts, and a lot of students with rubber mallets banging away at things. There was nothing revolutionary, though someone will actually look, there's new forms of fabrication. This kind of discussion in terms of the digital, I think, are a bit misguided. Because fundamentally, like these guys out here, when we say digital, maybe I'm part of them, maybe not, I don't know, but I think it's a bit alien. It's like talking about something, it's like talking about someone's mother. They know.
Well,
they know already.
It's a really alien subject, yeah.
No, I'm saying this only because I think it's very much part of our everyday. And I think the discussions become really interesting. And I'm very happy to hear that there is discussions by the scientific community and the artistic community and creative community, all these communities. But I think it's more out of need and less out of novelty. I think the scientific community is looking towards the artistic community because they are operating in different ways, and maybe we're at the moment of convergence where we could actually benefit from listening to each other.
I totally agree with that, but I think, I agree entirely that the reason the question of the digital is important is precisely because it's not new. Right? Precisely it is, as you say, in the blood, as it were. It has been for a long time. But if you think of, if you go with Delabor's definition of technology, which to some extent, for whatever it's worth, I would, the thought, firstly, the first point, that it's a form of knowledge, is absolutely crucial. But secondly, if it's universal knowledge, it by definition can't be new. So according to that, according to that understanding of technology, technology is that which is already universal knowledge. So in a certain way, anybody who points to a technology and says, I love this new technology, is missing the point. And anybody who points to a computer and says that it's new is, number one, sort of philosophically wrong, and number two, it's just completely boring, since we live in an age in which our toothbrush is computerized. So an architecture school says, hey, we've got computers. Anybody in anybody's house could say, so has my pop-up toaster. It's really like the least interesting claim a school can make. And of course we're in this other mode where and also I think the students have entirely different abilities to rethink that territory, precisely because it is not new, because it is just something that can be cooked, something can be worked, different recipes can be tried, can be tasted, and dare I say it, experimented with.
Sure.
Right?
I just bring up a point because Shen and myself were just having a very brief discussion, and I think maybe something that's very productive is in the act of revisiting some of these projects. Because we were afforded the opportunity to work with David next door and to actually look at projects that were done in a very particular time and then try to actually think about how was that, is it something that's valid today? If it's not, but just the exercise of stepping out from one particular time in a particular term and to try to readdress what those mean today in a design forum was actually something that was quite new. Because there was, in a certain sense, not a reinvestment of projects. You could say the project is bad or not, but at least there is some attempt to articulate different knowledge, because our form of knowledge is actually very different.
Well, what we're saying, we're not saying anything. I mean, certainly I'm not saying anything, in black and white terms. I'm not saying, technology or digital, whatever. I'm just saying, we are just part of it. There's no question about that. What I'm really saying is how much, at the moment, you can really build into it, and what kind of knowledge is productive and can be made productive, and what is left. The truth is, really, that in that sort of world that you're referring to, it's all interesting and fascinating, but you're probably dealing with a fragment of what really needs to be taken into account if you really want to do architecture. What worries me, and you referred to UPenn, I was there just 6 weeks now this year. What worries me about that is that the most intelligent people spend time trying desperately to get the best out of that particular program. The program has a possibility about limits. If you expect more, you're leaving the rest out unattended and unaddressed. And quite frankly, between you and me, the architecture that comes out of it is very banal. Very banal. It could be much more, because if you talk to the people what they can do otherwise, you're astonished, how much talent is left out of the conversation.
I agree. I'm just trying to sort of speculate about how to involve more people in part of this kind of discursive discussion, because I feel that at a certain moment, these kind of things, it's about including other sort of disciplines into something, but finding the mechanism where one actually can do that. I'm not suggesting one way or the other. I just think that outside, the world is a lot more radical than the conversations we actually have behind the doors in architecture school. And I think the discipline and the sciences and technology are much more advanced than we give them credit for. And they're very human-centric. I think people are using them in very profound ways. We just need to acknowledge that and actually have them to be part of the discussion, so it's not just a discussion of architects, engineers, and the theory.
Can I propose a sort of truce somehow?
Of course. It's a lot of truth today.
No, truce. Truth. No truth at all. My question is, what is this new we are talking about? And I'm wondering whether what we're talking about is actually the new, or rather if I borrow and transform, the situating of technology, I would say techniques. So we have a new which is old. You've given us 2 dates, Photoshop 1990 and the corporate field project Liam showed from 98.
Yes.
So it's not really new. Now it seems that what we're doing today is trying to address something which is already old with a discourse or critique, as the title says, which is also already old. As if theory or discourse were desperately lagging behind technology, technique, digital. Now, maybe what is new is really the attempt to bring them together and consider that maybe what the digital, don't know what I mean by it, and it's probably different from what you mean by it, and how it is understood is in the end a product of something. And that something is probably not only the biological, but also the thinking about it. And there's something which I'm terribly sorry we sort of bypassed in the first session, which was Pedro's idea of weak tech, which I think should be reconsidered. And I don't know if you want to expand on it, because it seems to be able to embrace this new without any prejudice, while at the same time suggesting that it is invested by desires and knowledges which precede it. And therefore, our attempts to cope with it and understand it are old. And as you teach us, the digital or the software which is used or the projects we are examining are also old. So maybe the new is actually this attempt to discuss them. I don't know if that produces some peace.
I think we can leave it here, in the truth moment, because it's 6 o'clock and it's time for Mark Wickley's keynote lecture. Unless there is something somebody wants to say from the panel or the audience, I think we can ask Mark for the introduction.
I can do it from here, no? I can do it from here, no? So this is good.